1,500 data sets, 150 plus structures, 18 publications, and we've worked on about 10 pipeline projects, so structure-based internal portfolio, structure-based drug design projects. We've really been fortunate. We have a great facility. It's been optimized for design and operation. You heard a little bit yesterday about things like vibration and EMI. So we have done the best that we can to eliminate those sorts of things. We're continually looking to innovate and address challenges that I think everybody in the field comes up against, things like sample thickness and stability and distribution. I'm going to touch on those today, but we're also looking at constantly pushing the size of things that we can look at, as well as sort of data analysis. Ultimately, we're trying to get the best possible throughput and resolution that we can get. And I'm going to touch on one project today that sort of highlights some of these. So we run things pretty well at Genentech. Our average running time is well above 90%. We run the Cryoses with serial EM. We average about 350 plus images an hour. For us, I find that data acquisition rate is not really limiting. Since we do all internal work, really sort of the bottleneck at the moment, I think, is processing the data that we produce and getting structures that way a little bit faster. But overall, I think we have pretty minimal downtime, pretty much standard stuff that most people see in facilities with maintenance. So as I said a moment ago, we're constantly coming up against challenges. I think everybody in the field does. One of the first things that we sort of encountered a few years ago is that in looking at the samples, you tend to get a fair amount or potentially a fair amount of thick ice, and this can be an issue. So what you're seeing here on the left is a Fourier transform from an image that has potentially a little bit thick ice. So that sort of, let's see if I can put my laser pointer on. There we go. This white ring that you're seeing here is the ice ring. It's from the scattering from the amorphous thick ice layer. And as your ice gets thicker, this ring gets a little bit brighter. And what that means is that in our CTF fits, we get a damping of the high resolution information. And we really don't get a reliable fit in the CTF in this particular instance out to about 5 angstroms. So that's a problem if we're wanting to get into the 2.5, 3 angstrom range. So in looking at our substrates initially, this was a few years ago, I came across the problem that the commercially available grids were really not all that spectacular. So as you can see, if we take an image of a hole at 0 degrees in projection, you can see it looks like we have nice thin substrate. But if we tilt that up to 60 degrees, we can see that we actually have this sort of nice ring of carbon around the edge of the hole. And what that means is that I can't really expect to get thin ice throughout this hole if I have this sort of large ledge here. And what we were finding was that with grids like this, we would freeze and collect data. If we're collecting close to the edge of the hole, we're getting these CTF fits, in the 6, 7, 8 range, which was not going to give us the high resolution information that we needed. So to address this issue, I developed a novel grid treatment method seen here. In short, I just use our in-house plasma cleaner to etch away the carbon and try and get rid of that sort of edge that we see on the holes here. And then after I'd etched that sort of edge away, you can see it's gone here. I would treat the grids with a very thin layer of gold palladium and then freeze. And we were actually getting quite nice thin ice. And then you can see the CTF fits that we were getting after we thinned out the substrate. We get a little bit better in the mid 3s. But sorry, and then in the actual data that we were seeing, again, now we're getting thin ice. We're not seeing that ice ring here. We're not getting the sort of damping of as much of high frequency information. We're getting our CTF fits well past 5 into about 3 angstroms. And so the procedure for doing this was quite time consuming, and the hit rate on it was only about 20%. I'd lose 80% of the grids to broken carbon and things like that. So I reached out to Quantafoil, and they have agreed to make these sort of thinner gold foil films. So they're available through special order. They're 25 nanometer gold. And this is what we use for probably about 95, 99% of the data collection and high-res structures that we work on. So sort of the next problem that we began to run into was with sample stability. but not stability in the sense of the samples falling apart during purification, but more with samples deteriorating when we would place them on the grid and freeze them. So this is a figure from a paper from Werner Krollbrandt's group, basically showing that in a data set, due to damage to the particles, you are only potentially using about 10% of the data. The rest of the particles end up being potentially damaged. And what I think the field has sort of come to the consensus on is that the main issue that we're running into is that we have this large air-water interface on our samples when we place them on the grid. And it's this air-water interface and the sample interaction with that leads to protein denaturation and this loss of high-quality data that goes into our data sets, and therefore also, reducing our throughput because you need more data to get to high resolution, and also potentially reducing resolution. So I began to dive into this problem pretty deep to see what it was that was actually happening to the samples sort of in solution. And it turns out that on the air-water interface, there is this net negative charge, which is most likely contributing to the samples binding and potentially denaturing. And so looking at ways to potentially interfere with that binding, detergent became sort of the obvious choice of what we would look at. Detergents can bind to that interface and change things like surface tension. But the issue that we begin to run into is what potential concentration should we use for detergent, which detergents in general should we use, because obviously at too high a concentration, your detergent can become detrimental to your sample in general. And so I screened the literature for what had been used and screened a number of different detergents and have sort of honed in on a few. This is a list for the project I'm going to talk about in a moment. This has a couple of anionics in CTAB and fluorinated phosphocholine, a couple of non-ionics, DDMOG and tween, and then LDAO as a detergent. And so this work sort of culminated in basically a detergent screening matrix that I use in-house for probably 70 or 80% of our samples. And this is something that I'm constantly working on and evolving. I have a collaboration with Bob Glazer's group at UC Berkeley, and we're working a lot on this particular problem. So this is one example of how that matrix helped out with this particular project. This is the nucleosome core particle. So you can see on the left, untreated, the core particle tends to denature and dissociate. But we found that with the addition of tween in this case, we would get nice intact core particles with nucleic acid. The CTAB tended to degrade the sample, though I would like to dive into this one a little bit more. I think it has a lot of potential. And then OG seemed to not really help much at all in this case. And then also what we were finding was that with the tween, we were getting nice intact particles, but we were also getting a nice thin layer of ice. So we had about a 35 nanometer, 33 nanometer ice thickness layer, so single particles in there. And then also a potential benefit that we were finding was that it increased the number of particles that made it into our final reconstruction. So with as I mentioned earlier, we were losing a lot of data potentially to denatured protein, but I think this particular protein in this particular project, this detergent helped to increase that number. So this led to a very nice 2.7 angstrom map and publication in Structure. So another issue that we're potentially running into, and I think a number of groups run into, is this idea that we're trying to get sample into the holes and nicely monodispersed as much as possible. But what we actually run into is that the sample likes to not go into the holes, but bind to the substrate like you see here. And so this is a sort of real life instance of that. This is the human 20S proteasome at 2 mg per mil. So what you should be seeing is a nice field of particles spread out in the hole, but what you're actually seeing is 1 or 2 proteasome particles making it into the holes. And so if we look at this on carbon, you can see that actually 90+% of the proteasome is binding to the grid substrate. And so, this is obviously a byproduct of the fact that we have to blow discharge our grids to make them hydrophilic. And so we're making them also negatively charged. So there've been a few publications out looking at things like self-assembled monolayers. So I went to the chemists here at Genentech and asked them if I wanted to bind a gold substrate, can you make a recommendation? And they recommended this PEG-8 lipoamide. So it has 2 thiol groups, so it binds quite tightly to the gold surface. The protocol for that is quite simple. I make a 4 micromolar solution of that in DMAC, incubate the grids for 24 hours, and then wash them with sample buffer and apply and plunge freeze as you normally would. And it's worked out pretty well so far. So on the left, this is a normal glow discharge grid of a membrane protein. You can see that some of this protein obviously still makes it into the holes, and it's being excluded in the thinner ice areas. The treatment with the PEG, we tend to get much more sample in the holes. And actually on the right here, this is that same concentration of 20S sample that you saw previously, where we weren't getting any sample in the holes. With the PEG treatment on the grid surface, we tend to get much more sample moving into the holes. And so, as I've mentioned, I'm still exploring all of these pretty much on a daily basis. I've started a collaboration with a group in France looking at fluorinated derivatives of these detergents. I'm also looking at other potential ways to block the sample binding from gold, other potential air-water interface methods in that collaboration with the Glaser Lab. And then also recently, there was a paper that came out on protein pegylation, and that's a technique that we're keen to try as well. And so I just wanted to quickly give my contact information. I'm always willing to share the results that I'm seeing. Unfortunately, I don't write probably as many papers and these things as I should, but I am always willing to have chats about it and share data and ideas. If anyone is interested in contacting me, you can reach me at any of these sorts of things, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Panel, and now, Julia, you're welcome. Please start sharing the screen. Next speaker is Julia Weisenberger from Cryo, and the title of the talk is Vitrojet, Advanced Control and Ease of Use in cryo-EM Sample Preparation. The stage is yours.
Yes, thank you. And you can see the screen. Everything's good to go?
All good, thanks.
All right, great. So yes, thank you for the introduction. My name is Julia. I'll be speaking about taking it a little bit further back to the sample preparation instrument. So I've been working on the Vitrojet. So this is a tool that was developed in Maastricht, and we're now commercializing it and bringing it out to the field. And I'll give a little bit of an overview on the system, where we stand. As Chris mentioned, I think he visited some time ago when it was still the prototype. Now we're shipping systems, installing them as quickly as possible, and basically go through the workflow for you to understand how we've kind of taken the instrument and changed the workflow a little bit. So of course, this instrument was developed to give reproducibility and control in grid preparation. We've implemented this through a number of features. So we've strived for automation of the system. So we do work with Preclip grids. Just to follow up on the previous talk, they can be any types of grids as long as they're Preclip, because that's just how they're handled in the machine. We've integrated the necessary components in grid making, including the plasma cleaning step. So this is a flexible plasma cleaner. So if you want to bypass it or hook it up with a different air supply, gas supply, that is possible. We've also developed a technique that's called pin printing. So this deposits an instantaneously thin layer without relying on extra wicking or blotting steps. And lastly, well, actually second to last, we can monitor the deposition through a camera that's placed behind the grid so that you can log the deposition and you have a clear understanding of what you will be introducing to the microscope. And through jet vitrification, we can work with these Preclip grids, and we've seen that we can achieve higher cooling rates. So this is just a short summary. We wouldn't have done this if we didn't foresee benefits for users. So by automating the system, we can minimize the operator variability and necessary training. Starting with a Preclip grid, you can prevent grid damage, reducing the often associated contamination in the transfer steps and the post-clipping steps. We use pin printing that uses a stock volume of 0.5 microliter of sample and actually only takes up a nanoliter, sub-nanoliter volume as you deposit it onto the grid. So sample usage is not a limitation. And finally, by visually seeing your grids, you can prioritize the grids that you send to your microscope and you don't have big shocks as far as black grids or empty grids, because this is all recorded as far as the layer quality. So this is just a brief history. While we are a young company, we were also involved in the Vitrobot development in the early 2000s. We have the good fortune of still having one of the inventors of the Vitrobot who actually continued in sample preparation, basically in automating the process, working on autogrid vitrification and moving away from blotting. So this was established in the mid 2014 to 17. Which followed with our first prototype, what we call the functional model. And yeah, we've launched the company by 2018. 2020, we launched the Vitrojet, and this year we've installed a number of machines, and we are still installing them, yeah, of course, into the long run. So this is just a little bit of the history. So with our prototype, we basically showed the concept. We showed all the different techniques involved, as I mentioned, with pin printing and jet vitrification. We proved a set of standard proteins to high resolution, wrapped it up in a publication, and basically proved the functionality of our prototype. From there, we've moved from this kind of open machine proof of concept to a more sturdy and reliable machine for different users around the world to work with. So from there, we partnered with a mechatronics company that's also based in the Netherlands and worked on the engineering and production of these machines. And these are just a few pictures from the development, the assembly. The machines are also assembled at the factory. So here on the left is what the machine currently looks like. So this is one of the machines that was actually shipped to one of the customers. That's the left image. On the right is still being assembled. The machines are assembled and they're accepted at the factory. So that means we work by depositing samples. We take a number of thickness measurements, test the protein, generally a standard protein, just to make sure everything's working fine. And then the machines are shipped. So now we've had a few installations. Here are just a few pictures from our recent installations. One was in the US, in Portland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and we have upcoming installations soon. So here, this brings me to basically where we stand now. I want to just show a short video on what our workflow looks like. So I'll pause during this to just explain. Basically, we developed a machine that can be fully prepared at the start so that the user can focus on the results and on, basically what you get from your camera images. So at the start, you see that our cryo module is actually quite large. This is because we fill enough liquid nitrogen in the cryo module, in the doer, to keep autofill of liquid nitrogen throughout the session. And we also have an ethane line hooked up to also maintain constant levels through a number of sensors in this cryo module. We pre-clip the grids at the start of the session, and we also insert a cartridge with 12 deposition pins. So I'll show you all that. And then we can focus on the actual results that come out of the machine. So here is the first interface element with the pre-clip grids that's inserted along with the pin drum holding 12 deposition pins for the session. And this is just an example of a sample that's picked up with 0.5 microliter stock in the pipette tip. Then the first deposition pin is inserted into the climate chamber. So here it's climatized to be maintained at dew point. And the first pre-clip grid is picked up. It goes into our integrated plasma cleaner where it's made hydrophilic. Here I'll pause quickly because this needs a little bit of explanation. Here you'll see a small droplet coming out from the inserted pipette tip. And you see our deposition pin here that's about to pick up a sub-nanoliter droplet and deposit it onto the pin. All these elements are climatized, so they are maintained at dew point. This is done to prevent evaporation or condensation from taking place. And here we have a representation of pin printing, deposition, and vitrification through our jets. Everything's cooled down and the grid is placed in a grid box automatically. So from here, the cycle, basically the session continues for up to 12 grids. And at the very end, the Cryo module is finally slid out so that you can either load the microscope or store the grids for later use. So this is the machine. We've also recently incorporated a user interface to walk the users throughout this whole preparation stage. This is just one page that I took from the GUI to show basically how you're walked through all the different prep stages. And the most important part of basically using the machine comes to the protocol. So here the user can control a number of parameters, including the plasma cleaning parameters, power, along with duration of plasma cleaning. And of course, if you're hooking up to a separate gas, that's something you would do outside the protocol. And we have a number of figures, a number of deposition patterns that users can choose from. With these, you can control basically in the training, your walkthrough how to control your layer thickness based on our theoretical model behind pin printing. Basically, by tuning the velocity, you can achieve thicker layers or thinner layers. By playing with the interspacing between the lines, for example, in the spiral patterns, you can introduce a thickness gradient or not. And also by playing with the standoff. So these are all parameters that users are trained on during the following the installation. And from there, you can work on just looking at your results and making sure that you can properly tune your parameters. Here we have just an image of the final product. This was taken from Portland, where we have a system. And lastly, we do work with automated focusing. I mentioned that one of the parameters is actually maintaining a standoff distance, so a distance that the pin is maintained from the grid, because the pin never actually touches the grid. And we do include an automated focusing to make sure that we can properly maintain that distance. Then we have quite a bit of testing going on. We also test the pin focus along with different depositions. And this is what I wanted to show you. This is just also a screenshot from what the user sees from our in-house system. So you see that after each cycle, so if you like, you can exchange your sample. So if you want to test the same sample for all 12 grids, that is a possibility. We have enough liquid from the pipette tip to go for 12 grids. But after each cycle, the user is presented with the question, do you want to exchange your pipette tip if you want to introduce a new sample? Here we say no. And you'll see that on the right image, you have the pipette tip that holds the sample. This is the deposition pin. And you'll see the pin approach the grid from the center, work its way out. And this is an example of an image that a user is left with. This is also automatically logged to the system so that you can keep track of the protocol you used and your results. In the installations, we do check that we have grid-to-grid reproducibility from grid 1 to grid 11 or 12. And from there, we go and make sure that what we are seeing from the camera really matches what you see from the microscope. So here we have just one example of testing parameters where you can see that here we purposely did not include overlap so that we could start with a more even layer compared to when you introduce an overlap in the deposition. And we see the clear correlation between what we get from our machine to what we get in the atlas. And this is very useful because actually in the screen, you can even zoom so you can clearly see even when holes are open versus filled. So this has been very beneficial, especially in prioritizing samples, especially when you are looking for grids that have slightly thicker or slightly thinner eyes. It's been a huge time saver. So this is another example where by tuning the parameters, we weren't sure where, in what kind of ice thickness this nucleosome sample that we tested at the Portland installation where would be, let's say, happiest. So we introduced some overlap in our deposition, did a bit of screening, and yeah, we were quite happy that during the installation at this service lab, we were able to take a fresh sample and find the right parameters for this nucleosome and resolve it to about 3 angstrom. So this is just some of the data that's coming out. We're slowly getting more and more data as more users keep using the machine and as more machines are being installed. So this is just a quick summary of where we stand. We have ongoing production of our machines, shipments, and installations on 3 continents, with a few machines being installed in Asia at the moment. And we are working on testing samples in collaboration with key collaborators, along with basically anyone who is interested. Of course, we are, my next slide is, we are hiring. So if you know anyone who is interested in working in cryo-EM and developing this new machine, and we've got plenty of projects going on, but we are always open for collaborations and demos, and basically just working together. So this is my contact info. So if you would like to reach out, if you have any questions, please don't be shy. And I think that brings me to the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much. First speaker is Bob Grazucci from Columbia University. Title of the talk is Practical Challenges in Running a Cryo-EM Facility, Training and Screening. Bob, stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very, very much for the invitation and for the people attending. Hopefully this will be an interesting talk. Be a little history, a little, practical guidance, hopefully. So let's get going here. So the Cryo-EM facility, so I'm going to talk about the description of what the facility is. For training, I usually use a little historical perspective. So what's behind the curtain of the user interface by showing the development of the microscopes from a Philips EM 420 to the Polara to the new Autoloader. I find this can give you the users or the trainees a better idea of exactly what they're controlling when they click these buttons or turn these knobs. Then I'll discuss the bottlenecks associated with screening and how we do it here at Columbia. So we're located in Manhattan, basically in the upper end of Manhattan. So this, let me see, this picture here is where the medical center campus is. This tower next to the George Washington Bridge. We're underneath where we have 2 Krioses and a Glacios and some prep systems. We've got a T12 Spirit here. Down in Manhattanville, which is 133rd Street, we've got a Krios there, and then we have a microscope that we own down that's run by the New York Structural Biology team. So this is the facility that we have in the Hammer building at the Medical Center campus. We have all the noisy stuff with our computer servers and stuff in here, and the HVAC and the chillers and all sorts of things like that. In this position, this is one Krios with the temperature controlled, humidity controlled, field canceling, vibration canceling systems that you need for any sort of system that's in Manhattan. Another Krios here, our Glacios here, prep room here, a little meeting area to discuss the projects. This is where the operators sit to control the microscopes. This is our facility is a university-wide resource. Our staff is Joachim Frank, won the Nobel Prize in 2017, is our scientific director. I'm the co-director. We have one assistant director, Jining Zhang. We're have openings for 2 more assistant directors. Our IT person, Harry, and our administrative coordinator is Mishkan Saidi. So these are microscopes. So we have approximately 10 active groups, more on occasion, with about 50 users. We do the reservations via iLab, and the internal users, the ones that are part of Columbia, get a subsidized rate. We have, as you can imagine, excess capacity with 4 Cryoses and the Glacios, so we can accommodate external users from academic and industry. So we have the 2 screening scopes. We also have a Techni Spirit for negative stain. It can also do cryo, but it's better left for negative stain on these 3 sites. The majority of the data collection we do is with Leginon, because it has the nice web interface, so you can see your data as it's coming on. Some users like to use cryo-EM. We're starting to get more and more into tomography, so that's kind of, we're leaning towards that as well. We're hoping to get some funding to get a Aquilos 2 and the CLEM system, so we can move into the tomography and as well as keep our single particle application processing going. We use CryoSpark Live and Appian for pre-processing our data and keeping an eye on what's going on. That's usually pretty good. Users are required to register in order to get access to the servers, and we keep the data secure by assigning permissions to each group, so they can only see their own data. All right, so this is the sort of a diagram of the pipeline. So we have the two microscopes and the Glacios in the Hammer facility. So we have the servers for the cameras feed into a image stack storage server. The control for the microscope and Leginon feeds into a database, Leginon does. And then the data, we have GPUs for processing data using either the Appian software or the CryoSpark Live, so we can keep an eye on what's going. Then it goes to a main 1 petabyte storage. All this is on 10 gigabit network. And then we generally keep the data for about 2 months. We have the capacity to store data on L7 or L078 tapes for long-term storage upon request. But most people download their data from the download server via SCP, SSH, or SFTP to their own home sites. So I'll talk about the historical perspective. So when I first, so I find it useful to see what the hardware is behind the user interface buttons that you're clicking. So when I first joined Joachim's group in 1986, we at the Wadsworth Center, it was just the beginning when the single particle processing was going on. It was still in its infancy. The EM420 was the workhorse for the single particle data collection of the ribosome. The detectors, as you can see, was film. It was a little harder to do, analog, but they were used for the same purpose as the direct detectors are right now. Storage was on reel-to-reel tapes. Storage was in gigabytes, not in terabytes. The processing was with overnight purpose-written scripts. So this low-dose kit sort of gives you an idea as to what you're doing when you're actually shifting the beam and shifting the image. So you had to dial in these specific image shifts and beam shifts via this box with pots and switches. This was our Perkin-Elmer scanner digitizer. So you'd put a piece of film here, and it had basically a light microscope that digitized the images onto reel-to-reel tapes. Each image took about 4 hours to scan. So you were kind of it took a while, so you could get some time off. So the development of the autoloader essentially was with the Polara. So when we bought it, the microscope was called the Philips F30 Helium. Then they decided they need to put cute names like Polara on it. So it was a cryo-only microscope that could use either liquid nitrogen or liquid helium. So we tried out some collection with liquid helium. It didn't really give us the bang for the buck that we were looking for, and it was much more expensive and time consuming to use liquid helium. So then with the advent of this, you could load multiple grids. You could put 6 grids. So the grid cartridges were reusable, unlike the ones from the current systems, and you could get overnight data collection capacity instead of having to have the postdocs or the students stay overnight every 3 hours to fill up the doors. The grid exchange was manual instead of clicking a button on the autoloader inventory panel, but it had software logics to prevent damage to the microscope. But like with anything else, if you didn't understand the system, it's tricky if there was a problem. And I'm sure that Wim can probably tell you the Polara has many of these tiny little wires that tend to break in the most inopportune time. And then if you don't know how to get around it, you're sort of stuck. So the next generation was the current generation was the Autoloader Evolution. So you could load up to 12 grids at once, but you have to really take care in loading the cassette so you don't drop something in the column or somewhere else. Has many moving parts and can get damaged if something goes wrong. So we want our super users, our independent users, to have an idea as to what's going on, as I said, behind inside the black box of the user interface, so they could, when they encounter an issue, they can do a little troubleshooting before they call us or before we call Thermo Fisher. So I was explaining to a few people that we recently had a problem that because we knew the system pretty well, we figured out. So the tip here actually came loose from the rod. So the version of the system that we have has the rod epoxied to the tip. So with extensive heating and cooling cryocycles, eventually the epoxy became compromised and the tip actually came loose. So the symptoms that we see, in case any of you guys ever see it, is it would take forever for the temperature to stabilize, and when you tilted, these braids would sort of pull on the tip and cause a big jump when you're pulling. So this is the inside of the autoloader, the cartridge gripper rod, the cassette insertion rod, then the columns over here. And here's a little video of exactly what's going on when you change the grid. So the gripper goes in, it grabs the grid, then this guy slides in, clamps it, pushes this out of the way, and then pulls the grid out. So so I always take advantage when something breaks and they need to open up the microscope for for things to take lots of pictures so the users can see what's inside the microscope. So we basically have some in-house training. We usually encourage the users, because the New York Structural Biology Center is close by, for them to go there and get some training. But so the different training levels are, we have a basic user has some training that's superficial, and they just sort of monitor the data collection and report problems when they happen. An intermediate user who knows how to do the collection, run the software, and do some basic troubleshooting. And then a super user who we try to get at least one from each group of those, so that they can help out when staff isn't available, like on weekends or after hours, and they can initiate a service call with staff direction. So the different training methods are occasional when they come in, online courses, an interactive virtual reality, or some sort of hybrid. But the most effective we find is embedding somebody, or actually working with them when they're in the microscope, at the microscope. That's the best way we find. So the focus training that we do are to address or to stress the weak points of the microscope, or the actual environmental conditions. So lots of money is spent on getting the environmental conditions perfect. The water and air temperature stability. So we often find that there's a problem with the condenser water in the building will raise havoc on our systems. The humidity as well. Being in New York City, we have extensive EMI fields and vibrations. One of our microscopes right outside the door of the building is the one train that runs right by it. So we have a very extensive, well-designed field cancellation system that we had to put in place. The microscopes are also on active vibration systems rather than a giant slab. The instrument has some weak links. So the main problems that we run across is when you're interacting with a vacuum system. So years ago, when we had film, that was one of the ways that there'd be an issue. You change the film, and then it would take forever for the desiccated film to get dry. With the direct detectors around 2014, that was when we switched over to all digital collection rather than film. The second weak point of the vacuum interaction is the exchanging of the grids. So with the side entry holders, you can dump the vacuum if you're not careful. A lot of these, what we found, a lot of these newer holders, like the ELSA holder that has a very heavy door, can cause some uneven pressure on the O-rings going into the microscope, which can cause the vacuum to dump if you don't support it properly. But with the autoloader, that's not as much a problem, but of course you need to be careful not to do something to cause a problem. So automation helped with that. So the screening bottlenecks. So we have two types of options that we do for screening grids. So you can put up to 12 grids into the microscope, but we generally use 4-hour sessions. So it's a bit, you got to be quick with doing screening. One of the screening is more of a manual operation. So we essentially put the grid in, we send a low mag image to the scope, we put down the flue screen, we go to the 4 points of the compass to look what the ice thickness looks like. Then we target one of the squares based on the shape of the square, basically sort of gives us an idea of the ice thickness. and do an eccentric height, center a hole manually on a flue screen, retract the screen, send it, go to a higher mag and collect an image and look at the particle distribution. Then if the particle grid sample doesn't look good, then we may discard it or further go on. So the more extensive and more the better way to do things, because you can have a record of what you're doing, is we use Leginon to collect an atlas. Then if it looks good, so see how this one has quite a bit of ice of what we hope is the appropriate thickness. We go to one of the squares, we go to each of the holes and collect data. So if you look at this one, it looks like there's some damage to the particles. So we may want to move on to either thicker ice or remake the grids with some sort of detergent or whatever, in order to make the damage less, like Chris was talking about in the earlier talk. If it looks like it's okay, they're intact, we'll run CryoSpark Live, which we do quite a bit, to see the performance of both the microscope and the particles. We collect a bit of data with the particles being picked, and then look at the 2D classification in order to see our complex of interest as to what if it's worth collecting, or if the user should go back to the wet lab. Of course, this is the user's choice to make, and some of them just prefer to go with the brute force approach, which is their prerogative. So we can do a ab initio reconstruction, and then if it's good enough, it goes into the refinement. But in general, we try to do just the pre-processing for the most part and deliver the data to the user. All right, so that's about it. But as I was saying, we are looking for 2 associate research scientists to help out with the running the facility and keeping our users happy. Here's the site to go to apply for the position. We're in New York City, so it's a very exciting place to work. We have a lot of very interesting projects and a lot of nice people to work with, and who are very into getting help and interacting with our facility. So I'd like to thank the Columbia University itself. We're in the Department of the Biochemistry and Molecular Biophysics and we're also at the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. We're supported by donations that are administered through the Office of Research with Michael, for the Physicians and Surgeons Office, Michael Shalansky and his staff. I'd like to thank our facility director, Joachim Frank, our steering committee, Art Palmer, Filippo Mancha, Sasha Sobolewski, and Larry Shapiro, and our technical committee, who helps out with workshops and development of any sort of technical development. Janang Zhang, who's one of our assistant directors, Ollie Clark and Tara Marsink, who are in various other departments that are helping out. That's about it for me. Thank you very much.
And the next speaker, thanks again, Bob. And the next speaker is Melissa Chambers from Vanderbilt University. The title of her talk will be Balancing Remote and In-Person Training and Operations. Melissa, stage is yours.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. So we've all had our share of changing the way we operate over the last year and a half. or even longer. And some of us still may be doing some of that. So I'm going to talk about how we found a balance between remote and in-person training and operations. So Vanderbilt University is located just outside, just outside downtown Nashville, Tennessee. We are in the School of Medicine and part of the Center for Structural Biology. So this is a center that has several associated labs and several resource facilities. So I'll go ahead and kind of introduce the facility and do acknowledgements up front. Scott Collier and I are the directors. Starting November 1st, Miriam Hader, we're very excited to have her. She's going to be joining us as staff. She came out of David Bella's group in Glasgow. Toru Nakagawa is our faculty advisor and scientific director. And then also November 1st, Sai Midori is going to be joining the Center for Structural Biology. He's going to be kind of the liaison for all the facilities in the CSB with our on-campus computing cluster. So our facility has existed in some format since 2003 when we got into Polera. The Polera still works. The last time anyone used it a year and a half ago. And it's still sitting in that same room, sadly, being unused. But since we've had the Cryos, really there's no need to use it anymore. So in 2007 and 9, the facility acquired a 100 kilovolt Morgani that we use for negative stain screening, TF20 for negative stain work and some cryo screening. And then in 2018, we started installation of our Cryos. We had a G3i. There seemed to be some issues that occurred during shipment and some parts were damaged. And so after about 9 months of using the G3i, worked well, just not in the way that we expected it to or that we purchased it as. The Thermo Fisher came in and took the G3 down and installed the G4. So we've been operating with that for the last year. Also last year, we are starting to get into more tomography and creating thin lamella. And so the School of Engineering has a Helios that's just down the hall from our Cryos. And we purchased a quorum cryo system to put on their Helios so that we can work at cryo temperatures. And actually today, engineers arrived to start installing our Glacios, which we're very excited about. And we also have purchased a Leica Stellaris confocal cryo clim that's going to be installed the first week of December. So while we are a bit spread out on campus, not quite as spread out as what Bob was sharing before, our newest equipment, and we're slowly kind of pulling everything to be over in the same center as in this beautiful engineering and science building. And the basement of this building was designed to house high-end instrumentation. So our Cryos is here. Engineering's Helios is here. This is other engineering and material science instruments. And then there was this big half of the basement that was unfinished. And so we were given 2/3 of it to build out for us. So we have created, we've built about 100 square foot dry room that we use for clipping grids. We've not yet moved a Vitrobot in there yet. We're still kind of debating if we're going to do that or not. This middle room is, as starting today, housing our Glacios. While we do have access to the Helios, we are going to be acquiring a dedicated FibSim for biological samples that will be shared between us and another core facility. And so that's going to go in the space. This is also where the Stellaris is going to be installed. And then we have this third room, which is big enough for a Cryos, big enough for a cryo arm, but it's our 5, 7, 10 years down the road plan. What's the field going to be like then? What are our users going to need at the time? So it's really exciting that we already have a built-in space to continue growing. And this is a view of it, so that we have the dry room at the end, a shared control room, and our 3 rooms off of that control room. So our user base, in the last 6 months, we have about 53 active users. Of those users are in 25 labs, and 17 of these labs are members of the CSB, of the Center for Structural Biology. So while a few are dedicated cryo-EM labs, more of them have a background in crystallography or NMR or even computational methods. And this is really good because these users understand the kind of stringent requirements for sample going into it, also data processing and model building. 8 others are from cell biology or from other fields. So we're kind of expanding beyond structural biology, and that's with, getting our in situ tomography going. We're attracting users from cell biology, engineering. Our Glacios, we're going to be doing some micro ED, so that has a couple labs from chemistry really interested too. 10 of these labs are using the Krios. All but 1 of them are doing single particle, and we have about a 2 to 3 week wait time for Krios, which we think is very manageable. And I'm sure, like a lot of people here, we have new people all the time that want to come and start cryo-EM projects. So these are either people that aren't experts or aren't surrounded by experts. They may be the one postdoc that has been tasked with starting a cryo-EM project in the lab. And so they don't have the luxury of looking around them and having people that can answer all their questions. So we're having more and more users that need help from the facility or through formal collaborations with other labs. So before March 2020, we did everything in person. We are a user-based facility and educational institution, so we train users to do everything themselves. The Krios is operated by staff, and we've kept it that way, but everything up to the point of collecting data on the Krios, we train users to do themselves, as well as after. They are responsible for processing their data. We would do one-on-one training sessions, sometimes 2 people at once if they were already working together very well or in the same lab. We want to train people with their actual experiment samples. So when they're ready, when their project's ready, we don't see much value in training them when they first start if it's going to be 6 months before they can purify their protein. And we monitored our Krios really just by monitoring the data that was coming off of it. We were using warp. So we would look to see to see what warp was telling us to indicate something was maybe going on with the Krios itself. And we also had quarterly user meetings. So this was more of kind of housekeeping items, what's new in the facility, what's going on with the equipment, some do's and don'ts. So in March of 2020, Vanderbilt shut down to non-essential employees. So lucky us, we were deemed essential, and we decided that meant we could keep the Krios running because it was already staff operated. We would shut down the rest of the facility. So for the Krios, we would image grids that were already in the facility. So no one had to come and bring their grids over, or if they were the SARS-CoV-2 samples, which we had several projects of that going on. Staff, I say staff at the time, it was just me and Scott. We would alternate, we'd go in once a week, load grids, set things up, switch out the liquid nitrogen tanks, and we monitor the progress via TeamViewer. And if we couldn't fix something, then we would go in. At the time, we were using EPU and our Falcon 3, and that all worked really well together. So we had very few issues related to hardware or software. In June 2020, we were able to open up and slowly resume operations at reduced capacities. We had some strict social distancing guidelines in place, so we had to modify our training. And it wasn't until April of 2021 that all the restrictions were lifted. We're still wearing masks at work. We had about 2 months this summer where we could take the masks off, but they're back on now. So we had to modify our training. The Morgani, which we use for negative stain, and it's the first microscope that new users learn to use. It's pretty robust, and it just gives them a basic operations, understanding of operations. That room was so small that we weren't allowed to have more than one person in that room until all the restrictions were lifted. Because this was also mainly used to train brand new users to TEM, we didn't feel comfortable doing it completely remotely. But we created videos of sample insertion, basic operation, and shutdown procedure. And that allowed a few users who were new to our facility, but not new to TEM, we felt comfortable letting them kind of train themselves based off those videos. We put all these videos on the computer there because while each lab had at least one person who was already trained to use the Morgani, there were some people that had come back after a while that needed some refresher training. They also may have been asked to do more work on the Morgani than they would for themselves to help other people in their lab who couldn't get trained. Our TF20 that we use for negative stain data collection and cryo screening, that room has weighted curtains for the airflow, and it had a clear window in it. So we could do some work in there and observe users and have users observe us with a physical barrier. But again, we didn't feel comfortable fully training a brand new user, but we would do refresher trainings and we could help users just like we did before. We also were utilizing originally TeamViewer, now we use No Machine to view the desktop, help users with troubleshooting. And kind of for the same reason before, our side entry cryo holders are so delicate and so many nuances with it. That was something we didn't feel comfortable training anyone except for hands-on and in person. So we knew a lot of facilities, both other facilities on campus and elsewhere, who spent a lot of time creating training videos and all this content, which I think is very valuable, but we did not have the time or the effort to do that. So we scoured what we already had available. We made sure to update our protocols, maybe add some more detail in those protocols. I'm someone that doesn't think you should be able to take a protocol and just sit down and do everything. I still think that you need to, there are nuances there that you need someone to talk you through everything, but we still tried to beef those up to make it easier for someone to follow. And we went back and looked through presentations and lectures we'd given in the past to see what can we take from those slides to make, to create a format that the users could easily refer to that would be helpful to them. We made some very simple movies, like I was referencing for the Morgani, how to load the sample, how to prepare negative stain samples. These were, I just did them on my iPhone, very minimal editing. This is something that we want to kind of put a little more production value into, but they definitely they did the trick, what we needed them for. And then there's a lot of content out there already. So everybody does things differently. So it took a little bit of searching to find the protocols and the videos and everything that's very close to how we operate. So I found this VitraBot demonstration video from Caltech that was pretty much spot on to how I would train users. So I felt very comfortable. If every user did everything they did in that video, I would be happy with it. So what we learned through this was that many of our users, once labs were able to open back up, they had a lot more things going on in lab before they could even get to EM. So it took a little bit of time for our facility to get back to normal operation with all the regular people coming in. We also realized that our users and our equipment, they're just not well suited for full remote training. Remote access is always a useful tool. So especially as we have very few people, we're spread out across campus. Even if it's not checking something on the weekends from home, if I'm doing something on the Cryos and someone has a problem on the F20, I don't need to stop what I'm doing, walk 10 minutes across campus, push a button for them. I can log in and either ask them to do it or do it myself. We've had time where we weren't sure if someone cryocycled the F20 in the evening. We can remote in and do that. Users appreciate, and a lot of them actually need this refresher content available. We don't officially have the designation of super users, but we definitely have users that we trust more and are a lot more experienced. But the majority of our users are not. They come and they use a use our equipment for 6 months and then may go away for a year or two before they have another project that's ready to come back. Correct terminology is really important. We try to emphasize this in our protocols and when we're talking to users, so that if they have to give us a call or send an email, we know exactly what they mean, and it helps us cut down on going back and forth. But Zoom meetings can be really good for that. So quick introductions to new people, if we need to discuss a project. We also use iLab for our billing and our scheduling, and we just switched to that this summer. So anytime you switch something like that, people have issues with their, setting up their account, finding what they need to do. So we can screen share with Zoom, show people exactly what they need to do. We also had greater attendance, but not necessarily greater engagement at user meetings and discussion groups via Zoom. So as we've all done, and some people are probably doing it right now, you have the opportunity to attend a meeting. So you put Zoom on your screen while you're doing other things at the same time. So what we've kept from this is we ask users to review these videos, tutorials, and protocols in advance of training and as needed. So we don't have a strict rule on when you need to be retrained, but if it's been a while, review these before coming to us and asking questions, even though we're always glad to help. We've also, when we were not training people as much, we had more time, so we were able to take on some projects for users. So that's, we still do a limited amount of that when we have time available. We use Zoom and when it can replace 10, 15 emails back and forth, or we can just get it all out in a 5-minute Zoom. We do that also to screen share. We have switched to using No Machine on all of our microscopes and even our data processing computers. We have it on the Krios and the TF20. No Machine was free. People on campus were already using it, and it was really easy to set up for Linux, Mac, and Windows. We use that to monitor Krios issues and correct them remotely when possible. We prefer to use EPU, digital micrograph or K3. We use Work for on-the-fly data assessment too, and we have remote transfer set up for data. We also have more frequent meetings virtually. So instead of having quarterly user meetings, we have a user meeting just about every month. And we've also started discussion groups. So this was kind of inspired by the roundtables that our national facility in CCAT in New York does. And so we found this is a way to have different topics, have a user present in a discussion style. And that really helps kind of keep the community engaged when we're still not all running into each other in the facility and just naturally having these conversations pop up. We are going to start moving to user meetings back in person next month. We'll see how that goes. So my last slide here is what we're still working to do. So we want to improve the quality and quantity of our videos and our detailed protocols. That takes time and effort, but it's something that I think will always be helpful and will always pay off. We want to find the best way to host these. We put them on our website. We put them in a shared folder. That's something we're trying to find out. Some people have brought up, using Slack or something like that, but then whatever it is, we need everybody to kind of buy in. The Krios is staff run, but we will train users who are dedicated to doing it. And that was this was brought up, made me think of my question I had for Bob about his super users. Our glacios will be operated by users, and both will be using EPU. So essentially, if someone has learned to use the glacios with EPU, it will be a lot easier to kind of get them comfortable on the Krios. And we can also, for the software, realize we can train users remotely for this. We're debating if we provide users with remote access or view-only access so they can at least monitor progress. We want to work on establishing on-the-fly processing all the way to some 2D class averages for the glacios and Krios data. And then we want to get workshops going using remote methods to kind of bring in the experts to help our users where we ourselves don't have the expertise. So that's kind of how we have incorporated remote access and training in our facility. Happy to answer questions and hear what other people are doing. Thanks.
So this is our last session of this 2-day workshop. And we have two speakers. The first one is Christian Dinemann from the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry. Title of the talk is Putting Biology First in a Cryo-EM Facility. Looking forward to the talk, Christian. Stage is yours.
Thanks, Simo, for the introduction and also for inviting and having me here to give a talk. So I'm located at the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry in Göttingen. This is our lovely institute. And actually the outside looks pretty much like this at the moment because it's autumn here. And it's just the weather that's not that nice at the moment, but it's almost like this. So to introduce us here in Göttingen, I will just give you a very brief overview of our small cryo-EM facility here. So in terms of instrumentation, we are running 2 Vitrobots and Leica AS600, and we are extremely happy with this. There were some questions and discussions about this yesterday. So we run it for 3 years, I think, or even 4 years, and it has been a great machine. We have an Aquilus FIPSEM at the moment, still version 1. We will get the upgrade soon. A Glacius 200 kV with Falcon 3 operated with EPU, and a Cryos G2 with a GIF K3, which is operated using cryo-EM. So in terms of stuff, we are 1 scientist, which is me, and I have a very brave and very motivated technician with me on the team. And our user base is only institute members. So we have MPI BPC research groups and also some affiliated groups which are not located on campus but in Göttingen. Overall, there are like about 40 scientists from 6 different groups. And when I look at the bookings in our for our equipment, then we usually have 20 to 25 active users at a time. So about 50 to 60% of them are active, and the others are inactive for whatever reasons, you know, biochemistry issues and whatever. Our operational model is very similar to some others, and actually it's very similar to what Melissa showed earlier. So we don't do pure service. We only do so-called pure service in collaborations. So then people send samples and I freeze them, screen them, and collect data if they look good. We are mainly something that I would call a teaching facility. So we train people on different levels. And as soon as people are trained, users should work independently most of the time. Method-wise, we do single particle cryo-EM, which is the majority of what we do. We also do a bit of tomography, and associated with it, we do a bit of FIPSEM, mostly lamella milling, and a tiny amount of SEM imaging on biological samples, but no slice and view or volume. It's in these cases it would be just like cutting something open with the beam and just taking an image of one layer. What's the most important for us is the biology that we do, and that's also why I wanted to introduce everything a bit differently here. So what actually shaped our facility over the last years is not so much the instrumentation, but actually what kind of requirements we got from the biology that the people working in the facility do. So it's quite diverse. So it goes from transcription complexes over various types of SARS-CoV-2 samples. So spike protein, polymerases, and so on. We have users working with ribosomes, membrane proteins. About a year ago or 1.5 years ago, we also started doing projects with fibrils. And on the tomography side, it's mainly mitochondria and chromatin related samples. And today I'm going to tell you how all this biology that was going on around us and which came to us and wanted to be solved in terms of structures, how this created requirements here at the Institute for the cryo-EM that we offer. Then I will show you how we actually designed and adopted certain parts of our pipeline to make it really fit the needs of the biologists working here. And in the end, I will also give a brief summary on the things that we learned and what this could potentially mean for the future of cryo-EM facilities at institutions like ours in Göttingen. Before I start, I will give you a very brief use case. The typical use case we have is that we have samples that look very beautiful on the micrograph level. So they were textbook in this case. This was a TF2H NER complex. This is actually the maximum biology I show you today, so don't worry. But the 2D classes always look shit on this one. And even the I mean, if 2D doesn't look good, the 3D is not gonna work either. So it always looked really, really bad. So there were numerous problems in this project. Luckily for the researcher, it actually worked out with a nice publication in the end. And after this project, when I went to this person and asked how many conditions and data sets did you need until it actually worked, I got a very long answer. You don't have to read it. What I want to emphasize is the last sentence. I don't want to know the exact number. And this is actually something that I encounter many times with the people I work here, that the biologists here or the people who are focused on the biological project, they actually don't want to know how many conditions they have screened and collected data on. They just want to get the project through to the end to actually make, to get something out of it. The main limitations in this case was infrequent microscope access for data collection, for initial data collection, because we always needed to collect data to see this, that the sample is bad. The second problem was that there was no rapid processing set up at the time to actually quickly assess the quality of the data collected. I have to say that this was before the times when we got a glaciers microscope. So this was all done only on a cryos, which was very brutal because we had to dedicate a lot of screening time. And there were also other projects that needed a lot of screening. So we dedicated a lot of screening time of our cryos to these projects. And then we actually got the glaciers in 2019. And this actually changed the whole situation. And this made us reassess all the problems and the requirements that we had in the facility. And we tried to identify the key requirements. What we have is a biological question usually that should be answered by cryo-EM. Most of this is not new, but there will be a few things that are important. So getting to the first sample takes quite long, but usually this is where we start encountering our users when they come with a sample. Then they make grids, they screen, and usually after screening the first rounds, they have to go back to the bench because the particles are just denatured. If they get to the step that the particles look nice, they collect data from whatever microscope. At the moment, they would usually collect glaciers data. I can spoiler this already, and then you get a reconstruction or 2D. And even then you have to go back to the bench and optimize your sample because as I just showed that even when you look at it in 2D or 3D, doesn't mean it looks good. Of course, what they want is in the end, they want to leave the cycle of sample optimization with a reconstruction that gives you a conclusion, a biological conclusion. So in the end, they actually don't care so much about this whole process. They want to end up here. And what I find interesting is looking at the time scales of all these different processes. So actually Henning Stahlberg was showing a very nice table yesterday summarizing some of the times needed for these steps. And it actually was matching what my observations are here. So when you have a reconstruction and you make a sample based on whatever, you have a bad reconstruction and you want to optimize it, this is usually in the range of days and weeks. And before we have optimized our workflows here, this whole process was in the range of weeks to months due to waiting time, slow processing, and so on. So what we actually figured out that we cannot influence this part because this is actually in the hands of the biologist preparing a sample. but we can influence the other parts from sample to reconstruction to make this more efficient. So we actually set out from scratch and asked our users for all these steps, what do you actually want? And the answers were pretty clear, and maybe they are not surprising to most of us, but for us, the answers were important to optimize things. So first of all, they wanted to have a microscope slot available within 14 days, because that's the average turnover time that they needed from here to getting a new sample to put it back into the pipeline. And usually when you have a reconstruction, then you already can book the next microscope slot and fit all the preparations in between. So our result was within 14 days. Additionally, they wanted to be able to come back after a long time and use exactly the same blotting conditions and just have things working. They wanted to screen grids with as little possible effort, because they actually need to spend a lot of time on the sample preparation part. So they want to spend as little time possible on this part. And the same for collecting initial data, and the same for actually having 2D or 3D results from collected data. So what they basically told us, they want to have the 2D or 3D best after the first coffee the next day, because then they can have a look and decide how to optimize the sample further. So for this, we aimed for like 4 pretty, at the beginning, pretty simple, but in the end, quite challenging aims. We wanted to make grid freezing long-term stable on the instrumentation that we have. We wanted to optimize the microscope scheduling to keep the waiting time within the zone that people require for rapid progress. And we needed to design the training and operation workflows to be very simple. And of course, in the end, efficient and fast data storage and analysis is important to get very fast feedback on your samples. This is briefly the pipeline, how it's integrated here. I will not give you much detail, but I just want to emphasize that 80% of the time users are circulating on these parts of the pipeline. And that's why I will only talk about this today, and I will only briefly mention the high-end data collection at the very end. So we started out to look at our sample preparation devices. And as I said in the beginning, it's 2 VitroBots. And to make our VitroBots the most reproducible, we actually tried to minimize the number of technical variables. I think there were like 2 years ago, I think Wim was already mentioning that at the EMBL, they also only use 1 VitroBot tweezer per machine. This reduced the amount of variation drastically. It is only minimum time loss for users because they need to dry it between each freezing. And for us, it was nice because we always could keep a replacement tweezer in the drawer. So if somebody dropped the tweezer, it was not a big problem. We could replace it within a few minutes and the user could move on. To actually make this work, we had to standardize our tweezer layout, the geometry. So we always buy the same tweezers. We measure the tweezers before. If they do not meet our requirements, we put them away. They are not that expensive, so this is fine. We get them fitted to these metal blocks by our workshop, and we also check that the tweezers are centered well in these blocks according to the procedures that Thermo Fisher recommends. The next step was that we needed a stable calibration for the machines. And I mean, many of you know that if you have blotting conditions and you go to a different place, it's completely different. Even between machines and between the engineers that calibrated the machines, there will be differences. So we set out to always measure it ourselves. So we started doing working with piezo elements to actually measure the pressure, but this actually didn't work out. It was too complicated and not very reproducible. So we actually stuck a piece of millimeter paper onto this white lid. It's an extremely simple solution. And at whatever blot force you want as a reference, you can just measure the gap of light coming through the pads without blotting paper on it. And this is what we base our calibration on. There is a value. I only show this tiny piece of a screenshot. If you ask your service engineer from FEI, Thermo Fisher, to help you getting this calibration done, they know where to find this value. And what's the most important for us is that whenever we have any change in the blotting pads, we always check that the pads are flat and they don't have variation. And I will show you GIF, which is running through the 16 blotting positions twice. And you can see that the width of the light slit actually doesn't change much. So we only accept blotting pads that look like this, because otherwise we get huge amounts of variation. With these very simple measures, we actually managed to get our blotting stable over the past 3 years already. And I do regular checks with apoferritin, and it looks basically the same for 3 years now. And as I said in the beginning, we have 2 machines, and even the 2 machines are able to produce the same blotting with the same parameters. Next was scheduling. To get waiting times down, we split our glacier scheduling to 2 slots per day, with maximum 2 active bookings per user. And this helped us to keep the waiting queue relatively short. So we have a day slot and an overnight slot. Day slot is usually used for screening, overnight slot for data collection. We bi-weekly block an overnight slot for cryocycle, and we block a day slot every week for small fixes, benchmarking, checks, whatsoever. And this actually helps a lot to keep the microscope running, because when there is a small thing to be changed, checked, or fixed, then we can use this pre-blocked slot for this. And recently we started using this for collaborations. With this kind of scheduling, our theoretical waiting times, which is along the green line, with 20 to 25 users are active, is right around the 15 days. That's the theory. The reality looks more like this. This is the average waiting times per calendar week over the last 3 years, or almost 3 years, on our Glaciers machine. You see they fluctuate quite a lot. You see spring 2020, where nobody was in the lab to use the microscope. You see a summer hold, which is usually vacation time. But the average waiting times are well between 10 and 15 days, which corresponds to our 20 to 25 active users. So as a result of making this type of scheduling happening, we got waiting times down to 11 to 13 days with some peaks, but they happen rarely. The other thing we changed is how we actually train and operate the microscope. So we split training sessions on the Glaciers in 2 different sessions. And the first session is 3 to 4 hours. We train EPU, where are the knobs, how to take an image, what to look for. And maybe if the person is interested, we do basics on optics and image formation. The second session would be another 4 hours. And this would be purely about how to set up a data collection with EPU, which already half was trained in this, because we use very similar workflows for screening as for data collection. So this is just an extension of this. We train on warp for on the fly, and we definitely do basics on optics and image formation. We teach protocols, which is very detailed step by step, including hints and notes to prevent errors, a few screenshots. But we keep these protocols right on this next to the microscope on the support PC, so people can just walk through this while they're at the microscope. And this has prevented a lot of problems in the past. And we actually managed to get most people independent after 2 4-hour training sessions, which means it's very little time required to get them going. And also it's easier for the facility staff, because we don't need to spend too much time on this initial training sessions. The last thing that we optimized, and this was actually the most difficult part, was the data storage and processing. So I will only put the Glaciers microscope in here, which produces about 150 data sets per year. So every second day, on average, we collect data overnight. Data goes through the offload data the server, which is located 500 meters away from the microscope. This works with the multi-mode fiber optics. This is really no problem. Then we just offload everything here. Then we put it to our central storage, which is just the generic storage system of our institute. We just got a distributed LAN client to make some of the connections faster. All the research groups have separate chairs. They can be mounted everywhere. And I implemented automatic checks for data that can be potentially cleaned up, and users get weekly notifications on these data pieces. We have a dedicated warp drive for just the Glaciers, which is VNC accessible, and just does all the pre-processing on the fly. And then there's a CryoSpark node for computing 2D classes, 3D reconstructions pretty rapidly. So, and then all the group-specific infrastructure is connected to it, so people can access the data and run it through. With this, usually users start a data collection in the evening. Everything is pre-processed overnight using Warp. People can even monitor it via VNC, change parameters in Warp and whatever they want. And the next morning, they just started 2D in CryoSpark. So this is not CryoSpark Live, it's just CryoSpark. And they get the results in 2D after first coffee and 3D usually after lunch. And with this processing, actually, most movies are deleted within 2 weeks, which means that we don't have too much crap data sitting on our central storage in the end. So now I would just include a bit of our Titan cryos in the end. So how do we proceed actually to high-end data collection? We do it when particles align, when a reconstruction shows the desired composition, because sometimes you want to see an extra factor, which might not be there when you do it in 3D. And you can all get this from the glaciers pretty easily. Small samples may bypass this if they're too small, so we go right to the cryos because we have an energy filter. And our rule is that only pre-screened grids go into the cryos, and the collectible squares should be known on these grids, so pre-screened in the glaciers. So every grid that goes into the Titan was in the glaciers before, and this saves us lots of time on the cryos and makes it much more efficient to set up data collections. And since the glaciers is doing the heavy lifting for us, cryos waiting times are extremely short, which is very nice for users, because as soon as the sample is good, they get their high-end data very, very quickly. I have to just put this in because I made this a few days ago, and it seems to work. What we do, so we have in 2019 in January here, we installed the glaciers, and since then the output of users using the facility went just up by, I don't know what, 300–400%. So I think the glaciers here and how we make use of it as a sample assessment machine actually did a lot to the biologic productivity of the researchers. I'm a bit late, but I'm almost done here. So since this is a session about the future, we were already thinking with a few people here, why do we actually need a high-end data collection machine at the Institute? Why can't we just go to an external national center or so on to collect the high-end data that we produce from the grids that we can produce from the grids that we pre-screened? So what I personally think is that one would, at least for single particle cryo-EM, one would probably be totally fine with a small footprint in-house facility with such a setup. And then as soon as you have a grid that's really good, you just make a proposal for getting high-end time on a cryos machine, get your pre-processing, maybe even some initial data as people showed before, and then you just feed it back into your processing infrastructure. Maybe this is even offered here, but I think it's always good to have this in-house. So of course, this can be, is just, an idea and can be debated, and whether this is good or not, and it might not work for Tomo. There's a few pros and cons to this. The small facility footprint is definitely a pro, because with the glaciers or a similar microscope, you don't need much space. Everything is fast and relatively streamlined. No maintenance of high-end infrastructure, and samples that you pre-screen on such an infrastructure would actually succeed in most proposal applications when you have good 2D or even 3D. The cons are that there are actually more users coming out of such facilities, also in our cases, instead of really well-trained EM microscopists, although we still do train properly for people that want to leave as a PI, for example. And also in terms of acknowledgement, it has to be figured out how such initial screening and data collection can be acknowledged. In the end, still microscope infrastructure, even in glaciers, is quite expensive. So maybe in a few years, hopefully with the cheaper microscopes, we might get there more easily. With this at the last slide. So first I want to acknowledge Patrick, who is running our department and who's my boss officially, and without him, I think we would not have the financial resources to actually set up something like this. Then Uli and Dimitri, we share an office and we discuss a lot and do a lot of stuff together, and he's very helpful with all the facility things. We have a very strong IT department with very capable people that help to get all this IT stuff integrated, and some prior people that actually did the very initial EM setup before 2018, before I took over. Svetlana and Shintaro, especially because they were my tiny advisory board on specific questions, and the whole lab of my boss. And there is a little bit of funding going in here. So I'm happy to take questions now.
Craig Yoshioka from Oregon Health and Science University. The title of the talk is "What is needed for the next jump in cryo-EM productivity?" Craig, stage is yours.
I'd like to thank the workshop organizers for inviting me to this workshop on best practices. My name is Craig Yoshioka, and I'm one of the co-directors of a cryo facility in Portland, Oregon. It's one of 3 NIH national cryo facilities in the United States. So ours is PNCC, or the Pacific Northwest Cryo Center. And we were formed in around 2018 to provide free access to training in the cryo-EM workflow, primarily single particle, and also free access to data collection as a service and resources for doing data collection. And so I feel like a little bit like I'm going to be a broken record today, because everything, in one sense, it's good. I'm not by myself out in left field, but everything, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about have already been touched on. But really, I like to think then about what's it mean to be productive, and what are we specifically talking about? And if you think of productivity, it's usually referring to a process. One can imagine that in this case, the process might be the entire cryo-EM workflow, all the way from making a sample to publishing a paper. Primarily, I think a lot of the times people specifically involved in cryo-EM will subdivide this process in many different divisions. The most common ones are the ones I've shown here. And these are useful primarily because these days, quite honestly, it's rare that a single person will be doing all the work for every step at a single facility with a single instrument, for example. And so a lot of times these divisions happen along these lines as well. One person's working on preparing the sample. They maybe work with someone else to screen it or collect data on it, and then they go back to process it themselves or find someone else to help them with processing. And I often think that anytime you have any process, any workflow that involves one or more coordination of one or more items, what you really have is a system. You have logistical problems. And so when I think of productivity, I think of breaking it up more along the lines of, there's different factors that go into productivity that you can try and maximize. And I would say primarily for people focused on data collection, for example, which would be myself and a lot of times, it's really easy to just get blinders and get stuck on trying to maximize utilization and throughput. But whenever you get a break to think about things, you also start pondering like how effective is your time actually being spent. And that's the measure of productivity that I think it's kind of interesting to think about. It's a bit more subjective, but there's always a sense of like, how much time am I wasting, essentially? And this is true of, to various degrees at every step in the path. So when we're talking about what's needed for the next step in productivity, today I'm going to be talking about some technical improvements, but nothing too specific, more about the kinds of features of the kinds of improvements that are useful for maximizing productivity, in my view. And then I think somewhat interestingly, and there's been referred to in other talks already, is the places where there could be significant logistical improvements. How do you improve policies and best practices to really unlock the next big jump in productivity? And this is rather new for me to think about in this much depth. I've only been started thinking about this a lot pretty recently. And in thinking about it and reading up on it, I found that there's like the main challenge to improving productivity, at least through logistics, is really in identifying and managing uncertainty in the process. And so that's something that you start seeing everywhere, right? If you start looking for it. And so the idea of uncertainty and logistics and how does uncertainty and productivity combine, they're not a good combination. Dealing gracefully or having processes that deal gracefully with uncertainty often require you to incorporate that with a lot of what some people will call slack. If someone else views the resources with a lot of slack, they might see a lot of idleness. And so this doesn't quite sit well with a lot of people, right? Especially if you're trying to maximize utilization and throughput. But I think it's worth thinking about because it's a fundamental truth, and it's not, it's fundamental truth that you start seeing everywhere, right? You start seeing it in networking and computers, like latency versus throughput, job scheduling on your cluster. Why is my job queued when 30% of the cluster's idle? Traffic patterns for congestion in cars, logistics, supply side chain. You see it everywhere. And I always like to, this is one of my favorite books I'd like to show real quickly in case anyone's interested. And primarily I've used this as sort of a Bible or something to fall back to for what it has to say about systems and how they behave and fail. And so the three first points are what I've for many years sort of thought about as a philosophy when it comes to dealing with instrumentation. But really there's something, a little bit of everything about systems in this book. And then more recently thinking about this, I saw this last point and it took on a new meaning or became clearer. And it's that loose systems last longer and work better. Efficient systems are dangerous to themselves and to others. And this is an example I found really recently. I think it's be good to share. There is an example of such breakdowns in logistics. For example, let's say a bank has tellers, and on average, a teller spends 10 minutes serving a customer, and on average, a new customer arrives at the bank every 10.3 minutes. Your initial intuitive take on this situation might be that everything's fine. One teller can handle this workload. In fact, it turns out if you're using proper modeling and proper probability distributions for these events, at equilibrium, one teller will have a line that's where customers are waiting for an average of 5 hours. And that's at equilibrium, right? After they've been at work all day, that's just sort of how long the line is. So I thought that was a pretty surprising initial thing. Even like more stunning, to me at least, was the fact that adding a second teller reduces the average wait time to customers from 5 hours to 3 minutes. So if you look up on Google, you can find more about this particular example, but I think it's a real showcase for sort of sometimes unintuitive ways that these things behave in systems. And so what's the biggest source of uncertainty in cryo-EM? I think a lot of people today and other times have pretty much repeated the point that it's the sample, right? And I think when you think of it in terms of this managing uncertainty and identifying it, it's identifying those things as quickly as possible. But why does this pose a problem for efficient productive scheduling, for example? Well, you can illustrate this point by just going through some common questions that someone that does data collection might be asked of by someone producing a sample. And it's things like what kind of microscope, which microscope should I use? How much data do I need? How quickly can you collect that for me? How many grids should I send for data collection? I sent a bunch of grids and you started setting something up and it's 7 o'clock and I don't like how things are going. Who's going to switch this? Can someone redo the setup? And then of course, when you go into a situation with this many unknowns, and things don't work out. Why didn't it work out? What went wrong? And so the answer to the question, how much does sample uncertainty affect data collection, especially if you take all of that uncertainty into data collection, is quite a lot. You don't even have the basics on what you need to efficiently plan or schedule things to be productive. And so I think one of the major points, and this is the point others have made too, so it's not new, is that screening is really the obstacle to this. And I think of it also as screening communicating to the community and to new users especially that screening isn't an obstacle, it's a process, or that you treat it as an obstacle at your own peril, because you're more likely to waste a lot of time if you do that. And so if you think about screening a little bit more, you might think about, well, what are you really trying to learn about grids? For data collection, what you really want to do, as Christian demonstrated, with adding the glacios and screening specifically the grids. And I think that's one of the real strengths of the autoloader, is not just sample throughput really, but how trivial it made it to work with the same grids and manipulate them and recover them and move them between microscopes. This really makes this possible in a lot of ways. But another sense you might screen for, which is actually probably where most people spend their time, is optimizing and becoming more confident about the grid making process. So I at least think of screening in two different broad categories. There's the screening you do to troubleshoot and optimize your the process that you use to make your grids. And then there's the screening you do to triage those grids, which I put more in the form of, there's a whole field of this analysis called process validation. I don't think cryo-EM is quite inexpensive enough to use the same rigor, but there's a lot of good ideas from that can be used for this. And so I think these are really the 2 points to key in on, and focusing on these points as a process really changes someone's expectations and goals going into a cryo-EM project for what's going to be needed and how to go about it in a way that is most effective. So just to summarize, some of the thoughts on this area, I think in terms of this specific area, there's so much room, of course, for technical improvements, like improved tools. The key point here is improving the consistency. And I think Christian showed that, for example, with the lengths efforts he went to make the Vitrorod setup that they have as consistent as possible. So there's lots of room for improvement here. I think there's also a lot of room for maybe more rigorous approaches in terms of things to offer new users, ways to go about trying to screen and optimize their conditions. And I think of this as two options, or two ways. One of them is that you want something more rigorous, but in another way, you want to offer people fewer options to maybe try, because I think there's a huge chance that people have choice paralysis when they approach this problem initially. And another thing that I like to point out is, if any part of your process involves trying to make something and you're new to it and you can buy it instead of trying to figure out how to learn how to make it yourself, this is what you should probably do to start off with, at least, because you want to make as much progress on your science and not spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out how to make your own graphene oxide grids, for example. Again, screening is important, and really focusing on learning something new and improving. Every time you put a sample in the microscope, even if you don't end up collecting data, you should have an eye on what you're trying to learn or what you can learn from that process. I haven't gone into it here, but I think other people have. And I think this is an important one, because really the effort required for these steps, especially sample preparation, but even screening as well, is best distributed. That is, like, it's not fair or possible for a center, for example, PNCC, to take on all the screening needs of the entire community. So the better distributed this is, the better everything will work out. And this goes hand in hand with, I think, newcomers to the field really need to disambiguate learning versus doing. That is, they have to be put to the question as quickly as possible: what are you wanting to learn how to do yourself versus working with someone else, letting an expert do it? And you don't put some thought into this, you risk inadvertently wasting a lot of time learning things the hard way when you didn't particularly maybe mean to learn them the hard way. So I have nothing against learning things the hard way. I'm a big fan of it myself, but I think it's important to know what you're getting into. Next thing, to talk about is data collection and touch on processing a bit. And when I think about data collection productivity, maybe it's because PNCC does this particularly for single particle quite a lot. Honestly, things seem pretty good already. We can collect data really quickly. I think the bigger question is how much uncertainty getting into the data collection side of things in terms of sample has a much larger effect on throughput too, not just success, but throughput than users might think. And so we commonly get asked questions about how quickly can you guys collect data? And the answer is it really depends on your sample. It depends on, well, one important factor actually to consider always is particle density. That's a huge place to get increased throughput. The higher density, the more data you'll collect, useful data you'll collect per unit time. But also just in terms of collecting images per unit time and the trade-off between maximizing image quality and quantity and the amount of effort required to set things up and get them going. All these things depend on how good the grids are, what kind of grids you're using, what's the approach to data collection. So that's all sort of the better handle you have on samples coming into data collection, the better handle you have on figuring that stuff up ahead of time and planning more effectively. Then at the facility level, there's a lot of things about that I worry about, for example, about policies and operational schedules and so forth. And that's getting a good grasp on how often and what kind of things go wrong with your microscopes. These are the kinds of things that take years to sort of learn how to effectively troubleshoot and recognize quickly the most common sources of problems. And so this isn't something that's quite easy to let users for example, train users to be independent and hope that they can take care of these things themselves. These things will happen. They're not super common, but they're common enough that you have to think about them. Scariest for me is how do you detect when something's gone wrong quickly and early, especially if it's something that can sneak under the radar if you're not being watchful. So it's identifying what those things are and doing the appropriate tests quickly enough, routinely enough to catch them. And then when you're operating and you have something happen, it's also a lot of experience, like what can you use to work around the situation and continue and maybe defer repair to later? What kind of factors require you to actually just give up and reschedule or call it quits on the data collection? And then again, a major part of this is the effort and coordinating the logistics of efforts to do this kind of stuff. If something fails at 2 a.m., maybe it's something that's relatively simple to fix, but who's going to fix it, right? And so these kinds of things affect productivity too. Finally, and this is something others have touched on as well, how do you, if you have a resource under contention, that is, you are building up a wait time, how do you prioritize and schedule things so as to minimize, maximize productivity? And I think Christian, I really like that he pointed out, because I haven't even started thinking about this a whole lot till recently. But there's other important factors to throughput other than throughput and utilization. What about latency? Like what's average wait time? What's the opportunity cost to users for having to wait too long? And if we jump back to the original point of there being slack and idleness in the system, these are two really important features that go together. It's really hard to have a system that has low latencies without it having the ability to deal with variations. It has to have idleness. You have to imagine that such a system will have some kind of store or bank of idleness built in to allow for lower latency. And so what kind of things do I think of to improve this whole aspect of data collection? And really, like we've already seen this happening, processing has moved more and more into data collection. I think this will just continue. I think in a lot of respects, these things will become more seamless and and it'll become less and less of a separate step. But there's a bunch of technical things in addition to some of the operational policy things I've been talking about. But I think it's important to remember that the features of the technical things are things that a lot of times people asking for money and getting the money don't actually think about, for example, a whole lot. And that's what, when you're looking at new hardware or new software or upgrades, what is the improvement to reliability, resilience, and stability from these upgrades? A lot of times that's, you get better capabilities on one end and you sacrifice, at least initially, a lot on the other end for these things. And so I place a high importance on features like reliability and resilience and stability. But it's hard to do that because a lot of times those improvements are more invisible. Finally, I think, yeah, getting faster and more accurate feedback. And I don't think this includes real-time processing and improving real-time processing. So Warp or CryoSpark Live or what have you. But I also think it includes a lot of operational things, like how do you schedule your checks? And then I've had to put a lot of thought, haven't gotten to work on it yet, but I would like to see not just faster checks, but more quantitative instrument checks. So things that quickly and identify issues and eliminate the possibility that something might affect the quality of data collection, for example. And I think part of this, and a lot of different folks have done this, but there's no sort of standardized or purchasable system for doing this, is full environmental monitoring and all the instrument telemetry being fed into both dashboards, but also it's appropriate to start thinking about how this might feed into machine learning to provide more quicker identification of possible problems. And which gets me to my last point, and really, like, I think the single biggest technical advancement that will unlock the next level of productivity has to do with really addressing a lot of those logistical difficulties in microscope operation and facility operation. And that is, if it was possible to fully automate screening and fully automate data collection, I think the productivity of these instruments would get yet another giant leap forward. And I can even see that this could be automated to such an extent that it really blurs the line and there's no longer a huge difference between screening and data collection, which will make these resources even more interchangeable and easier to manage. And I have a lot of thoughts I have on this particular subject and a plan, but I think it's good to point out that what are the possible productivity gains here? They're quite large. I think all the time about how by today's standards, if you look at before 2018, for example, at the highest end, we've set up data collections at PNCC that have collected in excess of 1,000 movies an hour at peak throughput, right? And then there's some that go much slower, again, of course, because of the sample quality. But really, what is the outcome of this? Well, in one sense, each of our Cryos is potentially 10 times more productive than it was 5 years ago, right? So it's not like we have 4 Cryoses, we potentially have 40 of them. So why aren't we kicking out structures, multiple structures a day, essentially? Because we're now at the point where if you have a good sample, you can quite easily kick out a structure a day. But why aren't we doing more? And really, I think this gets to the point of like, what's the minimum amount of schedulable time? How quickly can you react to observations that you've collected enough data versus the data sets the samples not going anywhere? And this is all automation. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone and take some questions and really say, like, a lot of this has been thoughts that I've had and thoughts I've had more recently. So hopefully it's been useful, but I'm also looking to kick off more discussions and get more back and forth about these sorts of topics.
Thanks a lot, Craig, again. Fine. We, I think, reached the end of our workshop, but our informal chats and discussion can keep going as long as we like in Gather Town. So I posted again here in the chat the link to join us. I would like to thank really very much all the speakers across the 2 days of this workshop and all the attendees for the really active participation, asking questions, discussion, and it was great. I hope you also enjoyed it. Hopefully next year someone else will host it in person so that we can finally meet each other again. And for the moment, I just thank again all the speakers and wish you a good night. Bye-bye.